The Chicago winter was not merely cold, it was predatory. It clawed at any exposed skin and seeped through the fibers of even the thickest wool. For Elena, huddled in the alcove of the St. Jude Medical Center's service entrance, the wind was a constant whispering threat. She wasn't there for a consultation. She was there because the heavy industrial vents from the hospital's laundry room occasionally exhaled a puff of lukewarm, bleach-scented air. Beside her, wrapped in a threadbare puffer jacket and a thin fleece blanket that had seen better decades, was 6-year-old Leo. He wasn't crying anymore. That was what terrified Elena the most. His silence was heavy, punctuated only by the occasional ragged wheeze that whistled in his chest. His forehead was a dry, burning hearth against her palm. "Just a little longer, Leo," Elena whispered, her voice cracking like dry parchment. She adjusted her position, trying to shield him from a fresh gust of snow that swirled around the concrete pillar. "We just need to get warm, then we'll find a place." The place didn't exist. They had been evicted 3 weeks ago from their cramped apartment in Cicero after the diner where Eleanor worked shuttered its doors. The shelters were at capacity, overflowing with the casualties of an unforgiving economy. For 3 days, they had been ghosts in the city, moving from bus stations to 24-hour laundromats until they were moved along by security. Above them, the hospital was a monolith of glass and steel, a fortress of health that felt 1,000,000 miles away. Through the double-paned glass of the main lobby, Elena could see the glowing Christmas tree, its lights shimmering with a cruel, festive irony. Inside that fortress, Arthur Sterling checked his watch. It was 7:45 p.m. As the chief financial officer of the hospital network, Arthur lived his life in increments of 15 minutes. His suit was tailored, his coat was cashmere, and his mind was a battlefield of spreadsheets, budget cuts, and quarterly projections. He had just finished a grueling board meeting, where he had to justify the scaling back of the community outreach program to keep the oncology wing operational. The burden of choice weighed on him, though he rarely showed it. To the staff he was the calculator, efficient, distant, and seemingly bloodless. As he stepped through the automatic sliding doors, the frigid air hit him like a physical blow. He reached into his pocket for his car keys, his Lexus idling in the heated executive lot just 50 yards away. But as he turned the corner toward the lot, he stopped. In the shadows of the concrete overhang, he saw a bundle of rags. Then, he saw the eyes. Eleanor looked up, not with the practiced desperation of a professional panhandler, but with the raw, hollowed-out terror of a mother watching her world evaporate. Arthur's first instinct, honed by years of urban living, was to look away. He had a 10 p.m. conference call with Tokyo. He had a life that moved at a different velocity than the one unfolding in the shadows. But then he heard it, a small wet cough from the bundle in the woman's arms. The sound triggered a memory, sharp and jagged, of his own son's struggle with pneumonia years prior. He looked at Elena's blue-tinged lips and the way she held the child, as if her own body heat could beat back the laws of thermodynamics. Instead of walking to his car, Arthur Sterling did something he hadn't done in years. He sat down, not on a bench, but right there on the salt-stained concrete, 2 feet away from the woman. "He sounds ill," Arthur said, his voice quiet, devoid of the boardroom's authority. Eleanor flinched, pulling Leo tighter. "We aren't causing trouble. We'll leave. He's so hot, sir. He's so hot, and the air is so cold." Arthur looked at the child's face, pale and glistening with fever sweat under the amber streetlights. He looked at his own polished shoes, and then at the woman's sneakers, held together by grey duct tape. The disparity wasn't just a statistic anymore, it was a physical weight in his chest. "I'm not asking you to leave," Arthur said, reaching into his pocket, not for his wallet, but for his phone. "I'm asking how long he's been breathing like that." Eleanor hesitated, her eyes darting between Arthur's expensive coat and the calm grey depths of his eyes. There was no mockery there, no condescension, only a strange, weary focus. "Since yesterday," she whispered. "It started as a cold, but today, he stopped eating. He won't even take water." Arthur nodded slowly. He knew the triage protocols of his own hospital better than anyone. He knew that if this woman walked into the ER alone, without insurance or an address, She would be stabilized and, within hours, sent back into the night with a prescription she couldn't afford to fill. The system he managed was designed for efficiency, not for miracles. "My name is Arthur," he said, ignoring the damp cold seeping through his trousers. "What's his name?" "Leo," she replied, her voice trembling. "I'm Elena." "Elena," Arthur repeated, testing the name. "Leo needs a nebulizer and probably a course of IV antibiotics. If you stay out here, his lungs will fill. You know that, don't you?" A single tear escaped Elena's eye, freezing almost instantly on her cheek. "I have nowhere to go. If I go inside, they'll call social services. They'll take him away because I can't give him a roof. I can't lose him. He's all I have left." Arthur looked at the hospital doors. He was the man who signed the checks. He was the man who enforced the no-vagrancy policies on hospital grounds. He represented the very structure she feared. "They won't take him," Arthur said, his voice gaining a sudden, steel-like clarity. "Because he isn't a case, why, he's a guest." He stood up, offering a hand to Elena. She looked at it as if it were a foreign object. For months, hands had only pushed her away or pointed her toward the exit. To have a hand offered in invitation was a shock to her system. "I work here," Arthur explained. "I have some influence. If we go through the front, you're a patient. If you come with me, you're under my protection. Let's get him out of the wind." Eleanor looked at Leo. The boy's eyes fluttered open for a second, dull, glassy, and unfocused. He let out a tiny, whimpering moan. That was the deciding factor. She took Arthur's hand. Her skin was like ice against his, but her grip was desperate. As Arthur helped her up, he felt the staggering weight of what he was doing. He wasn't just helping a woman. He was stepping outside the lines he had spent 20 years drawing. He led them not toward the emergency room, but toward the private executive entrance at the side of the building. As they entered the warmth of the hallway, the change in temperature made Elena dizzy. The smell of floor wax and antiseptic replaced the biting scent of snow. She felt exposed in the bright LED lights, her dirty coat and matted hair a stark contrast to the gleaming white marble. "Wait here," Arthur instructed, pointing to a secluded lounge area used by donors. "I need to make a few calls. Don't move." He walked a few paces away, his mind racing. He called Sarah Miller, the head of pediatrics. She was a woman who had fought him on every budget cut for 5 years. "Sarah, it's Arthur. I'm in the North Lounge. I have a child here. Severe respiratory distress, likely pneumonia. He needs a bed, a full workup, and total anonymity. No intake paperwork, no billing, no social service triggers. Put it under my personal discretionary fund. Yes, I'm serious. Get a nurse down here with a gurney, now." He hung up and turned back. Elena was sitting on the edge of a leather sofa, looking like a trapped animal. She was stroking Leo's hair, humming a low, wordless tune. "Help is coming," Arthur said. But as he looked at them, he realized that for the first time in his career, he wasn't thinking about the cost of the bed. He was thinking about the cost of the silence that had lived in his own heart for too long. The arrival of the medical team was a blur of motion. Dr. Sarah Miller arrived herself, her face a mask of professional curiosity that softened the moment she saw Leo. She didn't look at Arthur with her usual budget warrior glare. Instead, there was a flicker of genuine respect in her eyes. "He's very dehydrated," Sarah noted, her fingers gently checking Leo's pulse. "We need to move him to the pediatric ICU immediately for observation." Elena panicked as the nurses moved to take the boy. "No, I have to stay with him." Arthur stepped forward, placing a hand on the gurney. "She goes where he goes. I'll clear it with security. She's my personal guest." The walk through the hospital felt like a dream to Elena. People in scrubs moved with purpose. Machines beeped in rhythmic patterns that felt like a heartbeat. They were whisked into a private room in the pediatric wing, a room with soft lighting, a television, and a window that overlooked the city lights. As the nurses began the delicate work of starting an IV and placing an oxygen mask over Leo's face, Eleanor stood in the corner, clutching her elbows. She felt like an intruder in a palace. Arthur stood by the door. "He's in good hands now, Elena. Dr. Miller is the best we have." "Why?" Elena asked, finally looking at him. "You don't know us. You were going to your car. You have a life. Why did you sit down?" Arthur looked out the window at the swirling snow. I spent all day looking at numbers, Elena. I looked at spreadsheets that told me how much a life is worth in terms of insurance premiums and overhead costs. I think I just needed to see if I could still see a person instead of a number. He paused, a shadow crossing his face. And because a long time ago, I was the father in the waiting room, praying for a miracle. I had the money, and it was still the hardest night of my life. I couldn't imagine doing it while freezing to death. A nurse entered, carrying a tray of food, hot soup, bread and tea. "Mr. Sterling thought you might be hungry," she said kindly. The smell of the soup hit Elena, and her stomach cramped in a sudden violent reminder that she hadn't eaten a full meal in 48 hours. She took the tray with trembling hands. "Eat," Arthur said. "I have some things to arrange. There is a shower in the bathroom there and fresh clothes in the cabinet. We keep them for parents who arrive in emergencies. Use them." "Are you leaving?" she asked, a flash of fear returning. "I'm going to my office," Arthur replied. "I'm not leaving the building. If anyone asks you anything, you tell them to call Arthur Sterling's office. You are safe here." As Arthur walked down the quiet hallway, his phone buzzed. It was his assistant, reminding him of the Tokyo call. He swiped the notification away. For the first time in 15 years, the calculator was going offline. He had a different kind of balance sheet to settle tonight. He reached his office, a spacious suite with a view of the lake. He sat in his high-backed chair, but he didn't turn on his computer. Instead, he opened a drawer and pulled out a photo of a young boy, his son, who was now in college. He remembered the night the fever broke. He remembered the grace of that moment. He picked up the desk phone and dialed the head of the hospital's security and the director of social services. He had a plan, but it would require a level of corporate maneuvering he usually reserved for hostile takeovers. "This is Sterling," he said into the receiver. "I need a full background check on an Elena Vance, and I want the records of the community housing initiative that we shelved last month. Bring them to my office, now." By 3 a.m., the hospital had settled into its deepest hush. In the pediatric ICU, the only sound was the rhythmic hiss and click of Leo's ventilator assist. He was sleeping deeply, his color returning to a pale pink rather than a ghostly gray. Elena had showered. The hot water had felt like a spiritual cleansing, washing away the grime of the streets and the scent of despair. She wore a pair of oversized hospital scrubs, her own clothes currently tumbling in a dryer downstairs, thanks to a sympathetic nurse. She sat by Leo's bed, her fingers intertwined with his small, limp hand. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't scanning the horizon for threats. She wasn't calculating how many minutes until the next bus, or where the nearest public restroom was. There was a soft knock on the door. Arthur entered carrying 2 cups of coffee. He looked tired. The crispness of his shirt had succumbed to the long hours, and there was a shadow of stubble on his jaw. "How is he?" Arthur asked, handing her a cup. "His fever is down to 101, Eleanor said, her voice stronger. "The doctor says his lungs are responding well to the treatment." "Thank you, Arthur. I don't know how I'll ever repay this. I don't have anything." Arthur pulled up a chair. "I didn't do this for a repayment, Elena, but I did do some digging. I hope you don't mind." Elena stiffened. "What did you find?" "I found out that you were a head chef at the Gilded Plate before they closed," Arthur said, looking at a file in his lap. "I found out you have an associate's degree in business management, and I found out that your eviction wasn't because of negligence, but because the building was sold to developers who bypassed the grace period for tenants." Eleanor looked down at her coffee. "It doesn't matter how it happened. The result is the same. I'm a woman who couldn't keep a roof over her son's head." "The system failed you," Arthur said firmly. "The same system I help maintain. We create these black holes where hard-working people fall through, and then we act surprised when they can't climb out. You weren't asking for a handout tonight. You were asking for a chance to survive." "Why do you care so much?" Elena asked, searching his face. "A man like you, how you see people like me every day on your way to work. Why me? Why tonight?" Arthur was silent for a long time. The city lights twinkled outside the window, thousands of tiny lives flickering in the dark. "My wife passed away 5 years ago," he said, his voice low. "Cancer. This hospital did everything they could, but in the end, all the money and all the CFO power in the world couldn't buy one more hour. After she died, I buried myself in the numbers. Numbers are clean. They don't hurt, they don't die, they just balance. He looked at Leo. When I saw you tonight, I realized I had become part of the cold. I was just another piece of the Chicago wind, sitting down next to you. It was the first thing that made me feel warm in a long time. Elena reached out, her hand hovering over his for a moment before she retreated. You're a good man, Arthur, even if you try to hide it behind a suit. We'll see, Arthur replied. The board meeting is at 9 a.m. I have a proposal to make. But before that, I need to know, if you had a kitchen again, could you run it? Not just cook, but manage, logistics, staffing, budgeting. Eleanor's eyes sparked with a dormant fire. I ran a kitchen that served 300 people a night. I can manage anything. Arthur smiled, a real, genuine smile. Good. Get some sleep, Elena. The real work starts tomorrow. The boardroom on the 22nd floor was a cathedral of glass and mahogany. The air was thick with the scent of expensive coffee and the tension of impending decisions. 10 men and women sat around the table, the high priests of the medical network. Arthur Sterling sat at the head of the table. He had changed into a fresh suit, but he hadn't slept. Beside him was a thick stack of folders. The first item on the agenda, said the board chairman, a man named Marcus Thorne, is the final approval for the luxury wellness wing. Arthur, I assume the numbers are finalized. Arthur stood up. He didn't open the wellness wing folder. Instead, he distributed a new set of documents. I've changed the proposal, Arthur said calmly. A murmur ran through the room. Thorne frowned. Changed it? We've been planning the wellness wing for 18 months. It's our primary revenue driver for the next fiscal year. The wellness wing serves a demographic that already has access to world-class care, Arthur stated, his voice ringing with a new authority. Meanwhile, our own service entrance is a refuge for the dying because we've cut our community outreach to zero. Last night I met a woman, a chef, a mother. Her son nearly died of pneumonia 30 feet from our lobby because she was afraid our system would tear her family apart. Arthur, Thorne sighed, we are a hospital, not a charity. We have margins to maintain. Margins are meaningless if we lose our mission, Arthur countered. I am proposing the St. Jude Residential Recovery Program. We convert the old West Wing, the one we were going to demolish, into transitional housing for families of pediatric patients who are experiencing homelessness. We provide medical care, but we also provide a path back to stability. And the funding? A woman at the end of the table asked. That's a multi-million-dollar deficit. I'm liquidating the executive bonus pool for the next 3 years, Arthur said. The room went dead silent, starting with my own. Furthermore, I've already secured a commitment from the city's culinary union. We're going to open a community kitchen in that wing. It will provide meals for the patients and the neighborhood, and it will be a job training site. Thorne leaned back, his eyes narrowing. You're risking your career on a whim, Arthur. One woman in a snowstorm isn't a business model. It's not a whim, Marcus. It's a correction, Arthur said. And if the board rejects this, you'll have my resignation on your desk by noon, along with a detailed report to the press about our efficiency measures regarding the uninsured. It was a bluff, mostly, but Arthur knew where the bodies were buried in the financial records. He knew the board feared bad PR more than they feared a budget deficit. For 3 hours the battle raged. They called him a dreamer, a radical, a man who had lost his mind to grief. But Arthur held his ground. He showed them the cost of untreated illness in the community versus the cost of preventative housing. He used their own language, data, to prove that compassion was, in the long run, more cost-effective than cruelty. When the vote was finally called, it was 6-4. Arthur walked out of the boardroom, his legs feeling like lead. He didn't go to his office, he went to the pediatric wing. Leo was sitting up in bed, a cartoon playing on the TV. Elena was standing by the window. When she saw Arthur, she held her breath. The West Wing, Arthur said, leaning against the doorframe. It's a bit dusty. It needs a lot of work, and it needs a director of operations for the new kitchen facility. Elena's hands flew to her mouth. Arthur, what did you do? "I just balanced the books," he said softly. "You and Leo have a room in the transitional suite starting today, and you have a job, if you want it." Eleanor didn't say a word. She crossed the room and threw her arms around him. For Arthur, the calculator, the sensation of being needed, not for his money but for his humanity, was the greatest profit he had ever turned. The transition wasn't an overnight miracle. Real life is messier than that. The West Wing project faced immediate hurdles: plumbing issues in the old building, bureaucratic red tape from the city, and a lingering resentment from some of the board members who viewed Arthur as a traitor to the bottom line. For Elena, the first few weeks were a blur of intense work and lingering trauma. Even though she had a bed in the transitional suite, she found herself waking up in the middle of the night, checking the locks and listening for the sound of Leo's breathing with a frantic intensity. "It's okay, Mom," Leo said one morning, eating a bowl of real oatmeal with fresh berries. "We're inside now, the wind can't get us." Elena smoothed his hair. Leo was recovering well, his energy returning in bursts. He had even started a school in the playroom with 2 other children, whose families were part of the pilot program. Arthur visited every evening. He didn't come as the CFO. He came as a friend. He brought books for Leo, and sometimes sat with Elena in the gutted kitchen of the West Wing, looking at blueprints. "We need more than just industrial ovens," Elena told him, pointing to the layout. "If this is a training site, we need a classroom space. People need to learn the why of cooking, not just the how." Arthur nodded, making notes on a tablet. "I'll talk to the donors. We have a gala coming up. Usually it's a lot of people in tuxedos eating tiny hors d'oeuvres and talking about themselves. I want you to speak there." Elena froze. "Me? Arthur, look at me. I'm not one of them." "That's exactly why you need to speak," Arthur said firmly. "They need to see the face of the numbers they debate. They need to hear your voice." As the weeks passed, a community began to form. 2 other families had moved into the suite: a young mother with an infant and an elderly man who had lost his home after a medical bankruptcy. Eleanor took charge, organizing a communal dinner every night. They used a hot plate and a microwave in the lounge, but the meals were spectacular. Elena was rediscovering her power. She wasn't just a victim of circumstance. She was a leader. She helped the young mother navigate the hospital's nursery services and taught the elderly man how to use the hospital's digital records to track his medication. One night, as Arthur was leaving, he found Elena standing in the half-finished kitchen, staring at a set of high-end knives he had bought for her. "Is something wrong?" he asked. "No," she said, her voice thick with emotion. I forgot what it felt like to have tools, to have the things I need to be myself. For so long I was just homeless Elena. I forgot I was Chef Elena." "You never lost her," Arthur said. "She was just waiting for the storm to pass." The bond between them was growing into something neither quite understood. It wasn't a romance in the traditional sense. It was a deep, soul-level recognition. They were 2 people who had both been frozen in different ways, she by poverty, he by grief, and they were thawing out together. The night of the St. Jude annual fundraiser arrived with a typical Chicago blizzard. The grand ballroom of the Drake Hotel was a sea of shimmering silk and black ties. Arthur stood near the stage, feeling like an outsider in his own world. He saw Marcus Thorne across the room, laughing with a group of investors. Thorne had been trying to undermine the West Wing project at every turn, whispered rumors that Arthur was emotionally compromised. "Ladies and gentlemen," Arthur said, taking the podium. The room fell quiet. The calculator was speaking. "For years I've stood here and told you about our growth. I've talked about the new wings, the new technologies, the ROI. Tonight, I'm not going to talk about any of that." He signaled to the side of the stage. Elena stepped out. She was wearing a simple, elegant dark blue dress that Arthur's late wife's sister had donated. She looked nervous, but radiant. "This is Elena Vance," Arthur said. 3 months ago she was huddled in the snow at our service entrance. Her son was dying of a preventable illness because she was afraid of us. She was afraid of our system. Today, she is the director of the St. Jude Community Kitchen. Elena stepped to the microphone. She didn't use a script. She told them about the night the diner closed. She told them about the feeling of the wind on her son's face. She told them about the man who sat down on the concrete when everyone else walked by. "I didn't need a miracle," Elena said, her voice steady and clear. "I just needed a human being to see me. Most of you see a problem to be solved. Arthur Sterling saw a mother to be helped. And because he sat down, my son is alive. And because he sat down, 50 more people will have a roof next month." The silence in the room was absolute. Then, one by one, people began to stand. It wasn't just polite applause, it was a realization. That night, the donations shattered every record in the hospital's history. People weren't giving to a wellness wing. They were giving to the idea that no one should have to shiver outside a hospital door. After the speeches, Eleanor found Arthur on the balcony looking out at the snow-covered city. "We did it," she said softly. "You did it," Arthur corrected. "You gave them a soul, Eleanor." He turned to her, the moonlight reflecting in his eyes. "I realized something tonight. All those years I spent protecting the hospital's money. I was just building a wall around myself. Thank you for making me sit down." Elena reached out and took his hand. This time her skin was warm. "I think we're both finally inside, Arthur." Success always breeds resentment. While the gala was a triumph, Marcus Thorne was not a man who enjoyed being upstaged. 2 weeks after the fundraiser, a surprise inspection was called for the West Wing. The inspectors, prompted by an anonymous tip about safety violations, crawled through the construction site. They found minor issues, a faulty fire sensor, a dusty vent, and used them as leverage to halt the project. "I'm sorry, Arthur," Thorne said in a meeting the next morning, a smug smile playing on his lips. "But we can't have people living in a construction zone that doesn't meet code. We'll have to move the families out immediately, for their own safety, of course." "Move them where?" Arthur demanded. "The shelters are still full." "Not our concern," Thorne replied. "The law is the law." Arthur knew this was a direct attack. If he couldn't protect the first 3 families, the entire project would be seen as a failure, and the board would vote to pull the plug. He rushed to the West Wing. The inspectors were already there, putting up "Do Not Enter" tape. Eleanor was standing in the hallway, shielding the other families. "They're saying we have to leave, Arthur," she said, her voice trembling. "They're saying it's not safe." Arthur looked at the inspector. "What's the primary violation?" "The fire suppression system in the kitchen hasn't been certified for residential use," the man said. "It's a 48-hour fix, but until then, the building is uninhabitable." Arthur's mind raced. He knew the certification could take weeks in the city's bureaucracy, unless... "Elena, gather everyone's things," Arthur said. "Where are we going?" she asked, her heart sinking. She thought the dream was over. "To the Sterling estate," Arthur said. "What?" "I have a house in the suburbs with 6 bedrooms and a fully certified industrial-grade kitchen," Arthur said, looking the inspector in the eye. "If this building is uninhabitable, they will stay with me as my personal guests until the sensors are replaced. Try to find a code violation in a private residence, Marcus." The move was chaotic. Arthur's quiet, lonely mansion was suddenly filled with the sounds of children running in the hallways and the smell of Elena's cooking. Leo thought it was a palace. For Arthur, the house no longer felt like a tomb for his memories. It felt like a home. During those 3 days, away from the hospital's politics, something shifted. They weren't CFO and chef or protector and protected. They were just people. They spent an afternoon teaching Leo how to make snowmen in the backyard. They sat by the fireplace and talked about their favorite movies. Arthur watched Elena in his kitchen, moving with a grace and confidence he hadn't seen before. She was in her element. She turned his cold, professional kitchen into a heart. "You know," Elena said one night as they washed dishes together, "I haven't felt this safe since I was a little girl." "You are safe," Arthur promised. "I won't let them take this away." With the safety violations fixed under the watchful eye of a private contractor Arthur hired, the families moved back into the West Wing. But the battle wasn't over. Thorne had called for an emergency board vote to permanently dissolve the community initiative, citing liability risks. The meeting was set for Friday. Arthur spent the week preparing. He didn't just look at his own data. He worked with Sarah Miller and the social services team to gather the stories of the families. He gathered the testimonies of the donors who had given at the gala. But the real ace came from a source he didn't expect. An old friend of Arthur's late wife, a journalist for the Chicago Tribune, had heard about the CFO who sat in the snow. She had been investigating the developers who had evicted Elena's building, and she found a direct financial link between those developers and Marcus Thorne's private investment firm. Arthur walked into the boardroom with a folder that contained more than just budget figures. "Before we vote," Arthur said, his voice cold as the Chicago winter, "I'd like to share a piece of news that will be on the front page of tomorrow's paper. It seems there's a conflict of interest regarding the wellness wing expansion and certain real estate holdings." He laid the documents in front of Thorne. The chairman's face went from pale to a mottled purple. "This is blackmail," Thorne hissed. "No, Marcus, this is transparency," Arthur replied. "I suggest you step down from the board for personal reasons before the paper goes to print. In exchange, I might be able to convince the journalist to focus on the success of the West Wing instead of the scandal of the chairmanship." Thorne looked at the faces of the other board members. He saw that the tide had turned. Arthur wasn't just a calculator anymore. He was a man with a mission, and he was dangerous. Thorne stood up, gathered his things, and walked out without a word. The vote to make the St. Jude Residential Recovery Program a permanent, fully funded fixture of the hospital was unanimous. Arthur walked down to the West Wing. The kitchen was finally finished. The smell of baking bread filled the hallway. He found Elena at the center of a group of trainees, showing them how to properly dice an onion. She saw him and stopped. The look on his face told her everything she needed to know. "We won?" she whispered. "We won," Arthur said. "The program is permanent, and you are officially the director for life if you want to be." The trainees cheered. Leo ran up and hugged Arthur's legs. "Does this mean we don't have to move again, Mr. Arthur?" Arthur picked him up. "No, Leo, you're home." 1 year later, the St. Jude Community Kitchen had become a model for hospitals across the country. It had a 90% success rate in transitioning families into permanent housing and employment. It was Christmas Eve. The Chicago wind was howling again, but inside the West Wing it was 72 degrees and smelled like cinnamon and roasted turkey. Elena stood at the head of a long table. The room was filled with the residents, the staff, and even some of the board members who had once voted against the project. Arthur sat next to her. He was no longer the man who lived in 15-minute increments. He looked younger, the lines of grief and stress replaced by a quiet contentment. He had stepped down as CFO to become the CEO of the new St. Jude Foundation, focusing entirely on community health. "A year ago," Elena said, raising a glass of sparkling cider, "I was a ghost. I was standing in the dark, watching the lights of this building, and wishing I were invisible. I thought the world was a cold place that had no room for me or my son." She looked at Arthur. But one man decided that the concrete was a place to sit, not just a place to walk over. He reminded me that we are all just a few bad breaks away from the cold, and a few good hearts away from the warmth. The room toasted. After dinner, as the kids were opening gifts by the tree, Arthur and Elena walked out to the service entrance, the same alcove where they had first met. A new heated glass enclosure had been built there, with comfortable benches and a 24-hour welcome station for anyone seeking help. It was no longer a place of shadows. "I still can't believe it," Elena said, leaning her head on Arthur's shoulder. "Sometimes I wake up and I'm afraid I'm still in that dream, shivering." Arthur took her hand and tucked it into his coat pocket, the same cashmere coat, but now it was worn with the ease of a man who didn't care about the labels. "The dream is the reality now, Elena," he said. "The numbers finally balanced, but it wasn't the money that did it." "Then what was it?" she asked, smiling. Arthur looked at the falling snow, then back at the warm glowing windows of the hospital they had changed together. "It was the moment I realized that the most valuable thing I owned wasn't my bank account," he said. "It was the ability to feel the cold and the choice to do something about it." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. It wasn't a fairy tale diamond, but a simple gold band. "I've spent my life managing assets," Arthur said, his voice trembling slightly. "But you and Leo are the only things I ever want to invest in. Will you stay? Not as a director, but as my family." Eleanor looked at the man who had sat down in the snow when she was at her lowest. She saw the soul he had rediscovered and the life they had built from the ashes of their mutual loneliness. "I'm already home, Arthur," she said. Outside, the Chicago wind roared, but for the first time in either of their lives, they didn't feel the chill at all. They were inside, the hearth was lit, and the glass corridor was no longer a barrier, it was a bridge.